Hi everyone, this is Elena of the Witches Box, and I'm here today with another episode of Witch Booktube. And today we're going to be doing the thing that I mentioned that I wanted to do more of a few videos back, which is to give you kind of an overview of a grouping of books on a particular topic. And today's topic and the books that we're going to be talking about are all about ancestral work, which is a really big topic. A lot of you continue to ask questions about how to do this, what to do. I think just about all of the books that I'm going to talk about today, I've already reviewed or talked about here at Booktube in various ways and various videos that you can look for later. As I am recording this, we have yet to do our Witch Book Coven live on one of the books that we did send out for our readers for this month. But I wanted to include it in this book. Usually I don't review this until after that month is over, but I wanted to include it in this stack because it's such a great book. Let me just say, first and foremost, not every witch works with ancestors. You don't necessarily have to. A lot of people have trepidation over working with ancestors because they may have problematic, abusive, violent, horrible people in their ancestral line. I'm sure that if you go all the way back to the beginning, we all do. It's not a necessary thing, but it is an amazing source of support, of protection, of wisdom, of growth. We all stand here today on the shoulders of the people who came before us, and it can be a really enriching, potent path of work and of connection. Certainly, ancestral work comes up a lot. It's a question because a lot of people don't know how. Some people have conflicted feelings about doing it. You don't have to do anything you don't feel comfortable doing, but it is definitely a path, a working, a type of connection that is out there and available for you. So I'm going to give you the spines of the books that I've got to talk about. This is it. I'm going to go through them one by one. I am going to just kind of give you an overview of each of these books, and then I'm going to probably end with just the books that I really would recommend. You don't have to read all these books. A lot of times what you're going to find is that more and more, as more gets written about this type of work, similar things keep getting covered over and over and over again, so you don't have to read all of them. You can, but you don't. That's what I'm here for. I want to read all the things, and I'll share with you what I recommend and what I don't. I'm going to pull these out randomly. I really wanted to kind of go through these one by one in some sort of order, but I'm not going to do that. There are books that I recommend that you read, and there are books that I recommend that you just don't really need to go to because the other ones cover it. But I want to pull out a couple of highlights, and I'm going to start with this one, which I do recommend for the thing that I'm going to talk about. This is called Honoring the Ancestors, A Basic Guide by Galina Graskova. I did a review on this book. It's fairly thin, but man, like, look at the notes. It packs a punch, this book. I recommend that you get this book, and I'll tell you why. What is covered in this book is different than what I've seen covered in other books. Yes, there's an identification of who qualifies as ancestors, as you may or may not know. Yes, your bloodline is your ancestral line, but then there's also vocational ancestors, people who are part of the same type of grouping in the world that you are. There are religious lineage or spiritual lineage ancestors. There are our great dead that are sort of now honorary ancestors to us all. There are many different types. So this book will cover those different types, as a lot of other books do as well. It's been a while since I've read this book. I want to say maybe it's been 2 years. There is a whole section here that talks about every single person's intrinsic indigeny, that at some point along our ancestral line, our closest to the most original people of our line were indigenous to a land. They were tied to the land. They worshiped the land and the cycles and the spirits and the animals. They were closely knit, just as the native peoples of the America are still so closely tied. We, especially those of us who are of European descent, are tied to a land somewhere, but we have long left that space. And that tapping into those oldest ancestors is probably one of the first and most important steps to do, because the older the ancestor, the more detached from their dysfunctional patterns of being alive they are. They're further away from those things. But also, she speaks specifically to those of us who are of European descent who have, throughout quite a few generations of our own lineage, colonized and oppressed other people. And you have to come to terms with that. We all have, especially if you're white, especially if you're of European descent in some form or another, are people who are colonizers. And so coming to terms with working with ancestors who have done that, she talks about that, but she also talks about reaching beyond those people to those who were indigenous to the land, those who were of that space, who were true to their true spirituality and their true religion, who then along the line were conquered or oppressed by people who gave them an option, either a choice or I'll kill you if you don't convert, speaking specifically of Christianity and Protestantism and Catholicism throughout history. She speaks to those ancestors as they were indigenous until they betrayed their line, betrayed their gods and their worship and their people, and took on the religion of another, and then turned around and became oppressors and did the same thing to someone else. When I read about that, I mean, it put so much into perspective, and it also kind of shook my ground, and it was like, whoa, right? How many of us as European descendants in one way or another have a strong Catholic or strong Protestant or Anglican background for generations? And she speaks to that as a massive betrayal of your true indigeny in your ancestral line. The whole perspective to me was powerful and revolutionary and an important one to talk about that I have not seen talked about in any other book. And I feel like it's an important one. I'm just going to give you a quote. I would be reading 4 pages to you. This book was really powerful for me, and I recommend it for this reason, because it was uncomfortable to read. It made me take a look at things that I didn't really want to admit and I didn't like. And it's offering commentary on the all too common Christian, Catholic, Protestant, or Anglican backgrounds that a lot of us have in a way that makes it very uncomfortable to really sit with. So, again, a little out of context, but here it is. This leads me to the second horror one must eventually face. This is in talking about what you have to face about your ancestral line. First, we have to face and deal with what was done to us and our traditions. Then we have to look at what that turned us into. First, our own traditions were destroyed, and then, in some mad form of cultural Stockholm syndrome, we became the destroyer. This is the only book that I've ever read yet to date that talks about this in terms of particularly European ancestral lines and coming to terms with our colonialism, our imperialism, our oppression, our enslavement of people. But you can't ignore it. When you start to work with your ancestral line, you're going to come up against people who did things that you might find abhorrent now. And the way she addresses it is a no-holds-barred reality that is really powerful and really revolutionary. And for that reason alone, I really recommend this book, because it speaks to something that so many of us just don't have words for, don't quite know what to do with, and don't quite know how to face. It's Honoring Our Ancestors, A Basic Guide by Galina Kraskova. I can't say enough about this book just for that alone. There it is. This next one, because it's now next on the list, we just read this. We're reading this actually right now. The group is for our book subscription. It's by Patty Wigington. It's called Badass Ancestors, Finding Your Power with Ancestral Guides. I think this is a fantastic book. I'm going to give you a little peek into the table of contents. Chapter 1 is Ancestral Veneration Around the World, so you get a little bit of a cultural context as to how people venerate their ancestors around the world. Chapter 2 is Finding Your Own Badass Kin Through Genealogy, which is, by the way, something that she talks a lot about here, which I think this is why this book is particularly valuable. A lot of what she's covered has been covered in other books that I've got here, but this book talks or speaks most to how to find your genealogical line in different ways and resources to do that, which I think is super important and helpful. It's one of the questions that I get asked about a lot. A lot of you just, how do I find out? How do I know? How do I learn the names of these people? She talks about a bunch of different resources. However, they are very US and Eurocentric. A lot of us are having a hard time finding our lines, either because you're African American and a whole several generations of your family were enslaved and there's no record. For instance, with me, I'm Cuban. My grandparents, on both my mom's side and my dad's side, they came to Cuba from Spain, and the paperwork in that transition is cut off, it's lost, it's really hard to find. We've got countless family members now born in Cuba and died in Cuba, but because Cuba is just a shit show of bureaucracy that doesn't actually track anything, it's really difficult to find records and information from Cuba. There are people who are in South America and different countries where these types of record keeping become really difficult. And so she doesn't really speak to that and that particular difficulty. If you are of long-time European descent, she has resources for you. If you are longtime United States, and even I believe Canada, if you've got family there for many generations, it's easier to find those resources, and she speaks to that. But again, this is, I think, to date, the only book that I've come across on ancestral work that also goes into detail about those resources, so it can be really helpful in that way. So chapter 3 is setting up your badass ancestor altar for working with your badass family. She defines what makes a an ancestor, a badass. Chapter 5, rituals and meditations for your kin. Chapter 6 is problem ancestors. You can't choose your people. This is something that comes up in all of these books. Chapter 7, badass ancestors of the heart. 8, connecting to archetypal badasses. 9, divination and your badass kin. 10, eating your ancestors. It's not quite what it sounds like. Chapter 11, your badass legacy. So this is a great book. I love the two things. The whole help and resource list with genealogy I thought was really fantastic. And then connecting to archetypal badasses. So we've talked, these other books, not all of them, but some of them talk about belonging to specific ancestral groups that are not ancestral groups of blood, but ancestral groups of, for instance, all writers or journalists or painters or healers and doctors. That is a whole group of ancestors that you can tap into because you have the same calling and you can call on them and they have particular wisdom about those things for you. She speaks to archetypes specifically, which is similar to me and also speaks to me a little bit more deeper because, you know, I'm an archetypal girl, I'm a Jungian, and I love that type of vibration. And so it's the only book I think that has talked about it in terms of the archetype and tapping into that particular archetypal ancestral group. So phenomenal. Patty Wigington, Badass Ancestors, another one that I definitely recommend for the reasons that I stated. The next book that I have, and I think that I'm pretty sure that I have actually also reviewed this on our Booktube channel. This is called Honoring Your Ancestors, A Guide to Ancestral Veneration by Mallory Vaudois. I believe that's how you pronounce her name, or Vaudois. This is also a couple years ago that I read this, and for the most part you're going to find that this table of contents is also going to sound familiar, but there's a couple of things that I want to point out that is offered in this book. Table of contents, chapter 1, who are the ancestors? Again, they identify what the ancestors are, who they can be. Chapter 2 is healing ancestral trauma, which I think is probably the highlight of this book. Chapter 3, building your ancestral altar. Chapter 4, making offerings to your ancestor. Chapter 5, praying to and for your ancestors. Chapter 6, spiritual hygiene. Chapter 7, mediumship is for everyone. Chapter 8, going deeper with mediumship. Chapter 9, herbal allies for ancestral veneration. Chapter 10, calling on ancestral power. Chapter 11, a selection of spells. And then conclusion, remembering the future. This book, again, as you can see from the table of contents, covers some of the similar things as the other. What I really loved about this book is the healing ancestral trauma and that type of work. We carry trauma of our ancestors and we manifest them. You might find, depending on the kind of research and investigative work that you can do in terms of the history of your family tree, your ancestral line, that over generations and generations, similar traumas keep happening over and over and over again. That is definitely an indicator that that's the healing work that needs to be done. The other thing is that a lot of us, whether we have been, for instance, as an example, let's say your great-great-grandmother was raped. This is a horrible thing, but the trauma, the PTSD absolutely leaves a mark on her and all of the descendants after that. We carry those traits. We have, and there's a whole study on epigenetics that you can do research on later. None of these books actually speak to epigenetics, which I find actually interesting. I may be mistaken about that, but I'm pretty sure that they don't, which is something really interesting to dive into about that, because that's another way that these traits, these traumas continue to be passed down on a cellular level and on a genetic level between all of us. In any case, she speaks to healing ancestral trauma because we carry the wounds of those traumas, whether we want to or not. People call it karma. It's simply that we are all of a line and we're carrying things down. And oftentimes the work that we do with ancestors is healing of ourselves, but healing of the line behind us and healing of the line before us. So I love that she talks about this. She also goes into detail about spiritual hygiene, which is an important thing for our own personal, spiritual and physical and emotional and psychological health, but also for protection. I really love that. Mediumship and receiving and transmitting information from our ancestors. That's covered here as well. Really helpful. I liked it. It is not on the top 3 that I would recommend from this pile, but it was a good book nonetheless. So there's that. I don't actually know that I did a review on this. Healing Ancestral Karma, Free Yourself of Unhealthy Family Patterns by Dr. Stephen D. Farmer. I'm going to read the back of this book just to give you an idea of what's encased in it, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of a review. Has your family gone through the same trials and tribulations generation after generation? Do you feel fated to continue that trend? If so, it's possible you've inherited the karma of your family members. The good news is that you can break the cycle. Renowned author, soul healer, and shamanic practitioner Dr. Stephen Farmer shows you how to not only free yourself from negative cycles of the past, but also access the ancient wisdom of your ancestors. In healing ancestral karma, you'll learn how to make contact with your ancestors, heal hereditary traits and characteristics that have compromised your physical, emotional, and mental health, incorporate your ancestors' wisdom into the spiritual path, and clear karmic baggage so your descendants inherit only positive karma. This book has a lot of information in it. This is probably the second to last that I would recommend for a couple of reasons. Number one, I'm kind of having issues with the idea of it being karma. It's not karma, it's just ancestral baggage, but it's a really dry read. It didn't flow for me. The other books cover this in a way that I feel was way better. Some of this just felt like it was veering in different directions that didn't really feel helpful. I didn't really like the book. I'm always resistant to say that. It's not like if you read this book, you're not going to gain something from it. You will. I just feel that the other books do this better. Let me give you a little bit of what's in the table of contents so you can make a decision for yourself. The first part is getting acquainted with ancestors. Most books, if not all books, will give you a section on this. Ancestral veneration, cultural views and practices, the holy evenings of the dead, 3 types of ancestors, earthbound spirits. The second part is about making contacts with ancestors. So perceiving spiritual messages, blocks to receiving and perceiving, near-death experiences and ancestors, communication with the ancestors, mediumship, energy, DNA, and ancestors, quantum mechanics, biocentrism, and consciousness, visiting your parents' grave, automatic writing, divination with the ancestors, animal spirit guides as messengers, ancestors sitting and ancestors walking, ancestors' past lives and reincarnation, creating a family altar and family tree, trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, family secrets of dark law, changing your genes, first heal thyself, treatment modalities, addiction and 12-step programs, shaman and shamanic healing, guidelines for healing ancestral karma, energy healing, and it goes on and on. I'm not even going to continue going. The table of contents is really gorgeous in terms of, wow, that's a lot to cover. I just felt like sometimes it veered off the path and there was something missing here for me. And it was a long time since I read it, so I don't want to try to remember everything and then just be really incorrect about what I'm remembering. I just remember that I was really disappointed, even though there's great information in it. So this is a book that I would maybe give a 3-star, like on Goodreads. I have to look to see what I actually gave it. But it's something that I would give a 3 as in, it's solid. You can learn something from this, but I felt that it could have been done better. There was just something in the structure and in the information that was given that didn't quite vibe for me. But again, I gave you an idea of what's in it. If it's interesting to you, you can go ahead and check it out. It's not on my top 3. So there's that. This is the least of my favorite books. I did review this. This is by Raven Grimacy, and it's Communing with the Ancestors, Your Spirit Guides, Bloodline Allies, and the Cycle of Reincarnation. I did review this. I know that it's super unpopular to say anything negative about Raven Grimacy. I can never pronounce the name. But I felt like this was a book. And let me say that I read other things that he's written that I loved. This was a book that he probably should not have written. And I'm pretty sure that in the review that I did, that if you dig around Booktube in the review, I said it too, that this is probably a book that he should not have written. It really read like, and he made comments to this effect that it was like someone wanted him to write it and they kept asking him to write it. And finally he did it, but it wasn't even something that he did a lot of work with. And it totally came across in the book. I'm not going to give you a whole spiel about what else is in this book, other than I would not recommend this book at all if you really want to commune with your ancestors and work with your ancestors. It's a book that I don't know that he should have actually written. And from comments that he made in the beginning of the book, it was like he really didn't want to write the book. So yeah, I've read it. Don't do it. There are other things that you can do that would be better for you. So there's that. Obviously, that's the least recommended on the pile. Then there's this. Ancestral Medicine, Rituals for Personal and Family Healing by Danielle for PhD. This book really is, to date, the best book that I have ever read on this topic. For many reasons. I'm going to read to you the table of contents. It's the first book that I recommend always, because not only is it comprehensive, but it really, I'm pretty sure he's a psychotherapist. He may still be practicing, I don't know. But there is so much in this book about supporting your personal mental health, both in the working with your ancestral line, because issues will come up, both because you're dealing with family members, you're dealing with family dynamic, you're dealing with your own issues around people who may be problematic in your ancestral line. It's not a book that just talks about what that could be. It's a book that gives you help and support in how to deal with those things when they come up for you, which is so invaluable. Working with family, living or dead, will always bring up all sorts of wounding and issues that are hidden in the background, hidden in our shadows, because this is where we come to learn our stuff, our family. So to me, this was a really responsibly written, very knowledgeable book that not only gives you all sorts of information on who your ancestors are, how to connect with your ancestors, how to set boundaries with your ancestors, why would you want to work with your ancestors, and how to heal the ancestral line, how to heal yourself, how to not work with those who are still harmful, and how to take care of yourself spiritually and psychologically and emotionally and mentally while doing this work that can be incredibly powerful, but also very ground shaking for all of us on all levels. I really appreciated this book. So let me read to you the table of contents for this one. Part 1 is Foundations of Ancestral Work. Chapter 1 is My Personal Journey with the Ancestors. That covers making contact, family research, all those things. Chapter 2 is Who Are the Ancestors? So again, if you read any of these books, you're going to get that. Who they are, what they are, blah, blah, blah. Chapter 3 is Spontaneous Ancestral Contact. So dream contact, synchronicity, waking contact in non-ordinary states, waking encounters in ordinary states, all the different ways that you can receive messages from your ancestors and make contact with them. Chapter 4 in that section is Ancestral Reverence and Ritual, Common Intentions for Ancestral Rituals and Practices to Sustain the Ancestral Connection. Part 2 is Healing with Lineage and Family Ancestors. And there are several sections. I'm going to go down through that. It's the first chapter, which is chapter 5, Family Research and Initiating Ancestral Healing, which covers gathering what is remembered, considerations before working directly with your ancestors, choosing a focus for lineage repair work. So important. Chapter 6 is Meeting with Ancestral Guides using rituals to contact your ancestral guides, ways to deepen relationships and ancestral guides. Chapter 7 is Lineage Ancestors and the Collective Dead, what that lineage is, assessing that lineage, making repairs with older lineage ancestors. Chapter 8 is Assisting the Remembered Dead, emotional healing, forgiveness, and unfinished business. Psychopomp, elevation of the dead, and ancestralization. Work with the very troubled dead and related spirits. I mean, this is so important. Chapter 9, Integration and Work with Living Family, Prayer for Self, Family and Descendants, Embodiment, Channeling and Mediumship, Completing the Lineage Repair Cycle, Ancestor Work Beyond the Lineage Repair Cycle. Okay. Part 3 is Honoring Other Types of Ancestors. And so then it goes into Ancestors of Place, Affinity Ancestors, multiple souls and reincarnation, and joining the ancestors, preparing for death, funeral rites, and the body after death, ritual tending in the first year after death. There's an appendix here on distinguishing talking with spirits from psychosis. So really learning how to assess your mental state before receiving information. There are a couple of figures here that are not really necessarily important to my reading, but here it is. This book, it's the best book that I've read so far. And that's not to say that it's the best book out there, because there are different books that I have yet to read, but I, to this day, still come to this book, still reference this book. This is one of the books that still sits on my altar. I think I have a video somewhere in our repository here where I talk about how I do that and why I do certain books on my altar over time to continue to work with the information. This is one of those books. It's the best. So I've shown you all the books, but these are the 3 books that I recommend from this pile. So Ancestral Medicine, the Honoring the Ancestors, A Basic Guide, and Badass Ancestors. For the reasons that I said, but I'll go through it. This is comprehensive. This is so heavy on the healing and the work and the repair work that I think we all should be doing. It's so important. It's so powerful. And it really has reverberating effects, not just into your past, but into the future as well, and into everyone else. This is interesting. Someone mentioned this, and I'm trying to remember what the exact quote was, but it's really easy to walk around with thinking that you are the center of the universe, right? And your ancestors and your ancestral line is all coming down to you. But the reality is that in your generation, right now, I am not the only descendant of all those ancestors. There are hundreds, probably thousands of us alive right now that all belong to a particular ancestral line. And yeah, it branches, and at the very end of the day, we're all ancestrally connected to everyone, right? Because when you go back far enough, we all came from 1, 2, who knows how many. Okay. In any case, the work of connecting with your ancestors, working towards healing the ancestral line, doesn't just affect you. And it doesn't just affect you and your children and your children's children. It's affecting everyone in your generational line right now. The reverberations don't just go back. They come forward and they go laterally. So any work that you do now to connect with your ancestors, do healing work with your ancestors, touches them and who they're going to reincarnate and come back into as later, but also everyone laterally right now who's alive, who's part of that lineage stream, and everyone from them forward. It's really powerful work. It is broad reaching, wide reaching, and it can be incredibly rewarding because it's not just about the healing work. It's about the protection. It's about receiving the wisdom. It's about communing with your people in a really beautiful way. So this book, because of all the healing work, because of all that it's just so comprehensive in so many ways, not just in how to connect and how to perform ritual, but also the healing work, and also self-assessing and keeping yourself whole and healthy and considering those things while you engage. This covers a lot of the same information, not as in detail, but what I really loved is the resources for your genealogical research, which is important. You don't have to know the names of everyone. You don't. I don't. And I'm okay with that. You can tap in and work. They can sometimes tell you who they were. But genealogical research can be really beautiful in helping to flesh out the scope of who you're and what you're working with. And then there's this. Especially if you're of any type of European descent, I really feel like it's important to continue to consider what the spiritual lineage is in your ancestral line, where we've come from, what happened, who were we before that wave of Christianity, Catholicism, all the things that are wrapped up in that little bubble came and really pivoted a lot of us into being something that our forebears may not have wanted. And what the traumatic effects are and what the wounding effects are of that coming forward. It's a lot to consider. It was really difficult to read, and I'm all open to reading all about those things. And it was one of those things that kind of shook and was pivotal for me. And it gave a lot of information on how to deal with that kind of lineage breakage. So for that reason, that book. These 3. I'll list this below. That's not by any means to say that I don't want you to read the other books. The other books have their benefits, except for that one. There are other books out there, and if you've read other books that you think are really amazing, that you think that I'd like, or that you want to share with me, please go ahead and leave comments about those books down below. It's certainly a topic that I will continue to be reading about, probably for the long haul. And yeah, I'd love to hear more about what your practices are. Do you practice and do you work with your ancestors? What does that look like? Comments down below. I'd love to hear about it. Until then, I will see you next week. Take care.